What if I told you that the classroom, this place we associate with childhood, learning, and hope, was once more terrifying than a prison? That centuries ago, a child didn't just fear getting the answer wrong, they feared being scarred. For life, literally. Imagine your teacher carrying a metal rod heated until it glowed, or locking you in a wooden box without air for speaking out of turn. This isn't fiction, this is history, and it happened to children as young as 5. While today we debate homework loads and screen time, students in the 1400s were kneeling on sharp stones, being paraded through towns in dunce caps and burned for disobedience, all in the name of education. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a warning about what happens when cruelty is disguised as discipline, and when a child's spirit is seen as something to break instead of something to guide. Stay with me, because once you see what they called school, you'll never look at learning the same way again. 1. The classroom of dread. Imagine walking into a school where every creaking floorboard groans under the weight of dread. Not curiosity, where knowledge isn't nurtured but tortured into you, and the only diploma you can hope to earn is survival. This isn't the plot of a dystopian novel or the backstory of a villain's origin. It was everyday reality in the 1400s, and what happened inside those cold stone walls would shock even the most hardened modern minds. We're not talking about stern lectures or pop quizzes. We're talking about medieval classrooms that ran on fear, blood, and religious zealotry, where children as young as 5 were treated not as students, but as sinners to be broken. If you think strict teachers today are harsh, wait until you meet their medieval predecessors who wielded salt-soaked birch rods and spiked paddles like tools of divine judgment. These were not educators in the modern sense. They were enforcers of submission, using pain as pedagogy and humiliation as a curriculum standard. So let's dive into this harrowing world, one brutal, bewildering, and deeply revealing layer at a time. Because to understand how far we've come, we must face how far we fell. And it starts with what medieval teachers held in their hands. Chalk or books, but weapons, literal and metaphorical. Their preferred tool, the birch rod crafted from flexible branches, deceptively innocent in appearance, but designed to deliver agony with precision. A swing from this wasn't a symbolic warning. It was a full-force blow intended to tear into flesh, sometimes soaked in salt water overnight to ensure each welt seared with additional sting. The salt burned into the skin like it was trying to purify a soul, not correct a multiplication error. And in some German schools, they turned it up further using paddles with actual metal spikes. Imagine a wooden board embedded with nails, used on children for speaking without permission. These weren't punishments. They were public performances of pain, orchestrated to keep order through terror. And it worked. The crack of birch rods echoed off stone walls like thunder inside cathedrals. Every child sat frozen, every eye watching, every mistake punished in front of a live audience of peers who knew they could be next. Church records didn't hide these acts. They logged them. They normalized them. Broken bones, internal injuries, lifelong scarring, these weren't anomalies. They were accepted outcomes of what passed for discipline. Teachers weren't fired, they were thanked, and parents didn't protest. They praised these methods, believing violence was proof that their child was being properly taught. Today, the idea of a 5-year-old being flogged to unconsciousness would provoke global outrage. But in 15th century Europe, it was part of the school day. All of it was cloaked in righteousness. Pain was believed to drive out evil, to realign souls toward God. Schools operated as extensions of the church's will, and that will was merciless. There were no age limits, no warnings, and no accountability. A teacher could permanently maim a child and face no consequences. In fact, he might earn a commendation for his zeal. But here's the deeper question. Why was pain seen as the path to learning? And why did communities rally around it? To answer that, we need to look not only at what these teachers did, but what they believed. Because behind every blow was a worldview that said children were born broken and that salvation could only be earned through suffering. Knowledge was secondary. The main lesson was obedience, and the cost of failure was your body. These weren't schools. They were theological laboratories for control, pain their tool of refinement. We can debate educational philosophies all day, but one thing is clear. This was child abuse, institutionalized, moralized, and applauded. And this was just the beginning. Because if the birch rod didn't bend your will, the classroom would break your spirit in other ways, more silent, more suffocating, more sinister. The violence was only one face of a larger beast. And as we peel back the next layer, you'll see how confinement, silence, and humiliation became the foundations of medieval education. Not because they worked, but because they forced children to survive instead of thrive. And for many, surviving was the only goal they could dare to hold on to. 2. The prison inside the classroom. If a child in the 1400s managed to endure the sting of the birch rod without breaking down, the classroom had other ways to shatter their will, less visible but no less cruel. Where modern education might use a timeout chair to calm a student, medieval schools went a step beyond into isolation, degradation, and sensory deprivation. It wasn't just about punishing the body anymore. It was about reprogramming the mind. Let's talk about the wooden boxes. These weren't desk drawers or storage bins. These were child-sized coffins designed not for death but for humiliation and despair. Some were so small a student couldn't sit or stand fully, bent at painful angles for hours, breathing stale air through a single crack in the slats. Children endured a version of solitary confinement that would be outlawed in most modern prisons. And yet, these cages were routine stacked in corners of the classroom like props in a theater of cruelty. The idea was to build character, a phrase that somehow always seems to accompany systemic abuse. These confinement boxes weren't even restricted to indoor spaces. During winter, children were locked inside and placed in open courtyards, forced to choose between freezing air and suffocating fear. Some Italian schools even constructed punishment cells beneath staircases, like secret torture chambers hidden behind layers of piety. A student who asked too many questions or whispered to a friend could find themselves shoved into these wooden coffins for hours while the lesson continued. Outside, a lesson in Latin. Inside, a lesson in despair. There was no appeal, no adult advocacy. No one came to say, "This is too much." Even parents saw this as necessary. The assumption was that shame, silence, and physical suffering were the correct responses to defiance, however innocent the defiance might be. Breathing too loudly, for instance, was sometimes considered a disruption. Some boxes didn't even have proper ventilation. Monastic journals record children who emerge coughing, pale, shivering, having endured hours of forced silence in stale air. Others developed long-term lung conditions, muscle cramps, joint pain. This was education by way of imprisonment. Imagine a modern classroom where a student who forgot their homework was locked in a broom closet with no air or light. The outrage would be immediate, international. But in the 1400s, it was not only tolerated, it was encouraged. The more pain a child could endure, the more virtuous they were believed to become. Obedience wasn't just desired, it was demanded. Through suffering, and this is where the damage turns inward. The physical scars were real, yes, but the psychological wounds, those left deeper imprints. Generations of children learned to associate learning not with curiosity, but with dread. Asking a question wasn't a sign of engagement. It was a risk. Making a mistake wasn't part of growth. It was an invitation for public torment. We often talk today about creating safe learning environments. The medieval model was the opposite. Danger as doctrine, fear as structure. There was a kind of architectural cruelty to it. You see, every part of the school, the thick stone walls, the echoing chambers, the bolted doors, was designed not to inspire minds, but to contain them. And still, this wasn't the end of the punishment spectrum, because when silence and confinement didn't work, teachers reached for even sharper tools, not metaphorically, but literally. In some regions, children were forced to kneel for hours on sharp objects, dried peas, coarse salt, jagged stones. Think about that. A child, already terrified of making a mistake, now had to physically endure punishment that shredded their knees while keeping their backs straight and arms extended with heavy books. The body screamed, but the rules demanded silence. Moving earned more pain. Crying added another hour. This wasn't punishment, it was endurance theater. A grotesque blend of religious ritual and physical challenge, where the audience was a classroom full of terrified classmates, and the performer was whichever child had the misfortune of speaking out of turn. And if you're wondering whether these punishments had long-term consequences, the answer is absolutely. Medical records, those that exist, speak of infected wounds, permanent knee damage, joint dislocation. This wasn't a system that saw children as fragile minds to nurture. It saw them as miniature sinners to conquer, and the battlefield was their body. That's the terrifying truth of it. Learning wasn't the goal, control was. Teachers were less like mentors and more like wardens of a sacred prison, convinced that every flicker of resistance was a mark of the devil, and every act of suffering a spiritual cleansing. This isn't an exaggeration, it was often written down that way. Kneeling on gravel wasn't about classroom management, it was about salvation. This is the twisted logic that kept the system running for centuries. And the saddest part, most of these children never questioned it, because they were taught brutally and consistently that their voice didn't matter, that asking why was dangerous, that pain was proof they were learning. We look back now and shake our heads, wondering how anyone thought this was okay. But the deeper question isn't just what they did, it's what we still carry. Because when silence is rewarded, when obedience is mistaken for intelligence, and when fear masquerades as discipline, we echo the past more than we'd like to admit. But back then, fear was the curriculum, pain was the teacher. And for those who survived these methods, the scar seen and unseen lasted a lifetime. 3. Shame as a subject. By now, we've seen how the medieval classroom punished bodies and crushed spirits. But perhaps its most perverse achievement was how it transformed shame into a lesson one delivered not in private, but paraded across villages, stitched into clothing, shaved into heads, and announced with bells like a grotesque form of academic branding. You didn't just fail in silence. You wore your failure like a costume. Welcome to the next layer of this educational nightmare. Humiliation, not as consequence, but as curriculum. One of the most iconic tools of public embarrassment was the dunce capital, pointed hat, often emblazoned with the Latin word ossinus, meaning donkey. Sounds quaint, even cartoonish in hindsight. But in practice, this was a brutal branding exercise. The cap was oversized, deliberately ridiculous, and placed on children as young as 6. These weren't kids who defied authority or committed violence, they were just struggling to memorize Latin or stumbling through prayers. Imagine being 6 years old, terrified and confused, and having a teacher slam a cone-shaped insult onto your head before turning you around to face a room of gearing peers. That's not discipline, that's theater of shame. But it didn't stop at the classroom door. Teachers forced children to wear placards listing their crimes around their necks, did not complete homework, asked too many questions, spoke without permission. These signs weren't educational, they were declarations, and the audience wasn't just classmates, it was the entire village. In some regions, children had to march through town wearing these signs. Some were outfitted with bells that jingled with every step, announcing their disgrace like a walking alarm. Every ring of the bell said, "This one failed." Some were even followed by town criers who read their offenses aloud in the market square, turning private errors into public spectacle. Today, we worry about online shaming and cyberbullying. Back then, shame was analog but just as devastating. And it came from authority figures who claimed to act in children's best interests. The irony, parents often requested these humiliations. They believed that if the community saw their child's shame, the child would try harder. But that's not motivation, that's coercion. It's using embarrassment as an educational cattle prod. And it didn't stop with signs or bells. Some punishments were etched into the body itself. Teachers shaved students' hair in humiliating pattern circles, jagged cuts, strange symbols, all designed to make them instantly identifiable as failures. These weren't haircuts, they were physical announcements, and they lasted for weeks, sometimes months. Long after the infraction had been forgotten, the stigma remained etched into the scalp, visible to everyone. Imagine a child in a small town where everyone knows each other, walking to church, to the market, to their home, with failure literally carved into their appearance. There's no escape. That child learns not to question, not to try differently, not to explore but only to obey and hope no one notices them. It's a strategy of silence by design. Even within classrooms, students were isolated through visual symbols. There was the fool stool, placed in corners, facing away from the lesson. Students sat on it wearing additional signs, often with exaggerated collars or colored sashes that marked them as the one who messed up. Not only were they excluded from learning, they were visually framed as examples. And this brings us to one of the most horrifying realizations. Medieval classrooms didn't just fail students academically, they socially executed them. A bad grade didn't mean you needed tutoring. It meant you'd be exiled within your own school, and no one was immune. You could be the most obedient, brightest student, and one wrong word, one poorly written line of Latin, could land you in the middle of the town square, being mocked by strangers. The system wasn't about learning at all, it was about control through social terror. If you ever wonder why generations of people became conditioned to follow without question, look here. The system was built to train obedience by weaponizing shame. The ripple effect of this humiliation lasted long after a student left school. In a society where your identity was tied to reputation, those who had been publicly humiliated in childhood often carried that stain into adulthood. Fewer job opportunities, social mistrust, a lingering stigma of intellectual inadequacy. In some towns, Records of school punishments were shared with guilds or employers. Your bad behavior as a child could follow you into your adult life, haunting you like an ancestral curse. And that's what makes all of this even darker. It wasn't just physical or psychological torment in the moment. It was structural sabotage. Teachers became the gatekeepers not only of knowledge but of identity, and they could tarnish you forever with a single decision. And all the while, the system told parents, this is for their own good. But was it? Or was it a way to create generations who didn't think critically, who didn't speak up, who believed that if they suffered, they must have deserved it? This is where we start to see that medieval education wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. It didn't want thinkers. It wanted subjects. And to ensure obedience, it used shame as a scarlet letter, public and permanent. For, when grades were for sale, so far we've seen how pain, confinement, and shame were used to break students. But what if you could skip all of that? What if you could buy your way out of the beatings, the humiliation, the long hours kneeling on gravel? In medieval classrooms, that wasn't a hypothetical, it was policy, practiced openly and embraced without shame. Welcome to the twisted economy of medieval education, a system so corrupt it made grades a commodity and turned learning into a bidding war. In modern times, we hear of parents bribing college admissions boards or paying for private tutors. But in the 1400s, corruption didn't happen behind closed doors. It happened in plain sight, and it started early. The wealthiest students, often sons of merchants, clergy, or nobility, showed up not just with books, but with baskets of bread, wheels of cheese, jugs of wine, and sometimes gold coins. These weren't gifts of gratitude. These were transactional. Offerings, payment for protection, payment for leniency, payment for success. Teachers accepted them with full understanding. There was no pretense, no subtlety. The message was clear: feed the teacher, and your child will pass. Fail to pay, and your child will suffer. In Florence and Venice, historical records show teachers receiving monthly supplements from wealthy families in exchange for favorable treatment. And we're not talking about minor perks. These students got private tutoring sessions, easier exams, and glowing written evaluations, regardless of their actual performance. For poor students, the opposite was true. They received none of the privileges, no mercy, and absolutely no pathway upward unless they were lucky enough to find a rare teacher who saw them as more than their poverty. Most of the time, they were mocked, neglected, or simply ignored. A child could raise their hand with the correct answer and be bypassed. Their test could be tossed aside, ungraded, their efforts never acknowledged. Not because they lacked ability, because they lacked a loaf of bread to offer. The classroom became a marketplace, a microcosm of feudal society. And like all rigged systems, it reinforced the very inequalities it claimed to combat. School was supposed to be the one place where a child's future wasn't chained to their birth. But in practice, it was exactly that. In a world where knowledge meant access to clergy, guilds, and administrative positions, the classroom was the gate and the teacher its doorman. And that doorman accepted bribes. Education was never truly about fairness in these schools. It was about preserving hierarchy under the illusion of merit. And here's the truly insidious part. This wasn't seen as corruption. It was seen as custom. The community didn't protest it. Parents didn't rebel against it. In fact, some poor parents went into debt just to buy favor for their children. They weren't trying to game the system. They were trying to survive it. But it only worked if you had something to give. the child of a blacksmith who couldn't afford gifts. His chances of upward mobility were nearly non-existent. Even brilliance couldn't cut through that wall. And when churches stepped in to warn against the practice of educational favoritism, their words held no power. They issued sermons, but no sanctions. The bribes continued. The playing field remained tilted, and every year a new generation of children learned that intelligence mattered less than inventory. It's easy to think of corruption as something separate from cruelty, but in this case, they were married. Because what could be more cruel than watching a child who worked hard and did everything right get passed over simply because they couldn't afford the price of fairness? That's a different kind of wound, one that scars the soul, not the skin, one that whispers to a child, "You are not enough." And those whispers stay with them into adulthood, into parenthood, into cycles of generational exclusion. In medieval society, the classroom was one of the few possible ladders for social mobility. But if that ladder was guarded by toll booths, then most never had a chance to climb. You didn't just pay to pass, you paid to belong. And that meant the classroom wasn't just a place of learning, it was an auction house, one where the currency wasn't merit, but meals and money, and that truth echoed far beyond school walls. It fed into the courts, the clergy, the guilds. Those who got ahead did so not through knowledge, but through access. Education didn't challenge the system, it became its engine. And all the while, students were told that their failures were personal, not structural. That if they struggled, it was their fault, not the fact that their test had been graded by a teacher already full from another child's feast. And in this rigged environment, who dared to speak up? Who risked being labeled ungrateful or defiant? No one, because in a world where silence and obedience were already demanded, calling out corruption meant academic suicide. And so the cycle continued. The rich passed, the poor failed, and everyone learned the wrong lesson. That knowledge didn't matter, connections did. 5. The school that locked you in. Imagine a classroom where the door doesn't just close, sit bolts shut from the outside, where once you enter, your freedom ends until the teacher decides you've earned it back, where the concept of safety is so far removed from the learning process that it's not even an afterthought, it's an inconvenience. In the 1400s, this wasn't a punishment. It was standard operating procedure. Teachers locked their students inside from dawn until dusk, turning schools into cages with books and pews, and the walls themselves into accomplices. Not metaphorically, literally. Wooden beams slid into place across doors, thick iron latches dropped into slots, and the sound of that final thunk wasn't symbolic, it was a sentence. You're not leaving, not for fire, not for fresh air, not for a single moment of mercy. The rationale, control, absolute, unchallenged, and uninterrupted control. Teachers believed that locking children inside minimized distraction and maximized discipline. But what it really did was turn every lesson into a hostage situation. Fire, you're trapped. Illness, endure it. The concept of an emergency exit was centuries away from being invented. And they didn't just lock the doors, they barred the windows too. Not just to keep students from escaping, but to prevent the outside world from contaminating the solemn discipline within. These windows weren't large panes of glass with sunlight pouring in. They were tiny slits, high on the wall, with iron bars that made them look more like the arrow ports of a castle than architectural features of a place for children. And they served a psychological purpose too. When you can't see the outside, you forget there's a world beyond these walls, For many students, this was their only environment: dim stone, stale air, and the looming certainty that they were physically stuck. What happens to the human spirit in those conditions? A child's spirit. It shrinks. It doesn't dream or explore or question. It waits. It survives. And it obeys. But the consequences weren't just psychological. They were lethal. In 1478, in the town of Bruges, a fire broke out during morning lessons. Flames consumed part of the school, but the children couldn't flee. The doors were bolted. The windows were unreachable. By the time help arrived, over a dozen children had already died. Burned alive not because of an accident, but because of a policy. A belief that control was more important than safety. And if you think that event changed anything, it didn't. Teachers kept locking doors. Communities kept supporting it. In fact, many parents believed this kind of containment taught discipline and focus. It didn't occur to them that they were sending their children into fire traps every day. And why would they question it? This was a culture where obedience was everything. If a child learned to sit still, to stay silent, to follow at the cost of their own survival, they were considered well-educated. That's the part that still sends a chill down the spine. Because it wasn't just the fire that killed those students. It was the idea that authority mattered more than autonomy. That safety mattered less than submission. We often look back at the medieval period and marvel at the architecture of the stone cathedrals, the vaulted ceilings, the stained glass windows. But what good is a beautiful building when its very structure entombs its youngest inhabitants? The average schoolroom wasn't a sanctuary of learning. It was a pressure chamber. Poor ventilation meant that during hot months, classrooms became unbearable. Some children fainted. Others vomited. Still others developed long-term respiratory issues, but they weren't allowed to leave. Not for a drink of water, not for air, not even for the restroom. Every exit was sealed. Students learned early on that if they cried, it meant more punishment. If they begged to leave, it meant more isolation. So they adapted the only way they could, by suppressing every need, every discomfort, every cry for help, and teachers. They didn't see it as cruelty. They saw it as victory. Every minute a child endured in silence was proof that the system worked, that discipline was taking hold. But what kind of society applauds a child for not flinching during a fire drill because they've never had one? One that mistakes fear for learning. One that builds classrooms not to nurture but to contain. And still, parents supported it. Why? Because they were raised in the same system. They survived the same bolts and bars. And survival becomes tradition if no one stops to question it. But the truth is, this system wasn't just brutal. It was fragile. One sickness, one accident, one forgotten candle. That's all it took to turn a day of learning into a mass grave. And yet, the doors stayed locked. Not because teachers were monsters, but because the system taught them that obedience and unwavering was more important than life itself. And for children, there was no appeal, no school board, no hotline, no fire inspector. Once you were inside, you were trapped. Not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, emotionally. The walls were high, but the expectations were higher. Be silent, be still, be obedient, or be burned. 6. Child labor disguised as education. If a child in the 1400s managed to survive the rods, the shame, the silence, and the locks, they still weren't safe, not from the system, and not from the people who were supposed to teach them, because many medieval teachers, after tormenting their students, did something even more cynical. They put them to work. not as a lesson, not as enrichment, but as free labor. Schools became little fiefdoms, and students were not learners, they were workers, servants, janitors, and farmhands. Under the guise of character building, children scrubbed floors, harvested crops, milked livestock, and cooked meals for their instructors. Education wasn't just a privilege, it was a job. One that didn't pay, one that didn't end at dismissal, and one that blurred every ethical line. The logic, as always, was twisted. Physical labor, they said, built discipline, it forged humility, but for the students, especially the poor, it was nothing more than exploitation. Schools assigned these duties with no consent from parents and no concern for safety. Kids, as young as 7, were handed sharp tools, made to clean chamber pots, or sent into freezing woods to collect firewood. This wasn't chores for responsibility. This was systematic servitude. Some schools in Eastern Europe required students to spend half their academic day laboring, not helping, not learning, just working. And while the teacher got warm food, split wood, and clean floors, the students got sore hands and no time to study. If you failed a test, you didn't get a tutor, you got sent to muck out the stables. In some cases, wrong answers in arithmetic meant latrine duty. That's right, failure led directly to punishment by sanitation. What kind of lesson does that teach? That your mistakes are filth. That your value is tied to your usefulness, not your mind. And the division was stark. Wealthy students were rarely made to work. Poor students did everything. Their intelligence didn't matter. Their effort didn't matter. Their role had been decided the moment they walked in with worn shoes and no bribe basket. Teachers faced no regulation, no limits. No one tracked how many hours a child spent sweeping stone floors or hauling water. No one asked whether it interfered with learning, because for these children, education wasn't the goal. Obedience was. Exhaustion was. Indoctrination through effort. And for girls, it was even worse. In wealthier schools, female students were routinely pulled from lessons to cook, wash clothes, and serve food mostly for the benefit of male students and teachers. They weren't just working, they were being trained, not for scholarship, but for servitude. Medieval education didn't prepare girls for careers, it prepared them for kitchens. This wasn't a bug in the system. Was the system gender? Roles were written into the school day. Boys who failed became laborers. Girls who excelled still became cooks. If you were a bright peasant girl with a love for language, the best you could hope for was being allowed to stir soup in the same room as the boys learning Latin. Some parents accepted it. Others didn't even know. But in truth, they had no say. Once a child entered the school's gates, the teacher's authority was absolute. And if that teacher believed that scrubbing a fireplace taught humility better than reading a psalm, then that's what the child did. For hours, days, sometimes years. And the worst part, the community saw nothing wrong with it. Children were expected to work. Work built virtue. Virtue built character. That was the logic. But the reality was this. A child carrying firewood in the snow didn't leave with a stronger mind. She left with frostbite. A boy gutting fish in the school cellar didn't walk away wiser. He walked away reeking of someone else's dinner, having missed another lesson on scripture or arithmetic. The cost wasn't just physical, it was generational. Every moment spent in labor was a moment stolen from possibility, from potential, from a future that might have looked different if only someone had said, let them learn. But no one did, because these weren't elite students. They were poor. They were expendable. They were tools to keep the classroom warm, the teacher comfortable, and the illusion of moral discipline intact. Think about it. In modern schools, we argue over whether kids should get homework or longer recess. But in medieval schools, the debate was whether a 9-year-old should be in class or out back slaughtering chickens because the teacher was having guests over. This wasn't education, it was exploitation. And it didn't end when the day was over. It ended when the child was broken or when they were too sick, too poor, or too female to be considered worth the trouble. What began as an opportunity to learn ended as a lifetime of unpaid labor, disguised as learning. 7. When a detention became a sentence. If you thought medieval education stopped at beatings, humiliation, confinement, and unpaid labor, brace yourself, because some punishments didn't end when the school bell rang. They extended beyond the classroom walls, beyond the church, and into the very foundations of the legal system. In the 1400s, teachers weren't just instructors, they were gatekeepers to the dungeon. Yes, literally. In a world where church and state operated as one, educators had the power to escalate even the smallest infraction into a legal matter. A student who spoke out of turn, mocked a verse, or failed to show remorse could find themselves not just disciplined, but arrested, not metaphorically, arrested, by real officials, under real charges, sent to real jails, and all of it could begin with a dirty look. Teachers partnered directly with church courts, and many were deputized with ecclesiastical authority. This meant they could report students to religious tribunals for moral disobedience, blasphemous conduct, or public disruption. If a child cracked a joke during Latin recitation, they could be sentenced to public stock, to stand immobilized in the town square while villagers spat, mocked, or pelted them with rotten food. If they grumbled about chores, they could be whipped by court order. If they scribbled graffiti on a pew, hard labor for a week. In today's world, the same behavior might earn a timeout or a call home. But in medieval classrooms, it meant entering the justice system not as a student, but as a convict. Some offenses were so minor they wouldn't register on a modern teacher's radar: whispering, sneezing, asking a question too many times. But in a world obsessed with order, these were signs of rebellion, and rebellion was sin, and sin had consequences. Take the case of Johann Zareel, student from a monastic school in 15th century Cologne. He laughed during silent prayer. The teacher, incensed, marched him directly to the local church court. The punishment, a public lashing followed by 3 days in a holding cell with no food. His crime, disrespecting sacred instruction. His age, 11, and stories like his weren't rare. Some children served week-long sentences of manual labor digging ditches, cleaning latrines, or hauling bricks for monastery repairs, all because a teacher felt disrespected. And what made it worse, the escalation was instant. There was no warning system, no parent meeting, no counseling. The teacher simply filed a complaint, and the system kicked in. Most students didn't even know they'd crossed the line until they were already in chains. And once inside, the punishments compounded. Students who fidgeted in court had time added to their sentences. Those who cried were mocked. Those who pleaded were told their tears were proof of guilt. It wasn't a justice system, it was a punishment loop. One designed not to correct, but to crush. And it worked. Word spread quickly among students. Don't talk, don't question, don't blink too loudly. Fear replaced curiosity. Submission replaced thought. The classroom wasn't just a place of instruction. It was the first step in a disciplinary pipeline that led to stocks, work camps, and, for the truly unlucky, death. Some students, especially boys from poor families, were imprisoned repeatedly, each time for smaller infractions. The cycle became self-fulfilling. A boy who had once shown promise became a troublemaker, not because of who he was, but because of who the system believed he had to be. And for their families, the consequences didn't stop at humiliation. Parents were required to pay fines to retrieve their children from jail. These weren't minor costs. For a family already struggling to survive, the sudden need to produce coins meant selling livestock, food, or future wages. And that economic pressure did something sinister. It made parents complicit in the punishment. Because once you've paid for your child's release, you want them to stay out of trouble. And what does trouble mean in a world like this? It means thinking for yourself, asking questions, laughing too loudly. So parents told their children, don't resist, don't ask, don't speak. The system created its own chorus, its own enforcers. And that's how it sustained itself, through fear, through silence, through generations of children taught not to learn, but to obey. Imagine being 10 years old and walking to school knowing that if you made one mistake, you could end up shackled in the town square. And no one, not your teacher, not your priest, not your parents, would stand up for you. That's not education. That's tyranny with a textbook. And perhaps the cruelest part, most of these children never got the chance to return to class. Once marked as problematic, they were often barred from future instruction, expelled by law, blacklisted, forgotten. The system didn't correct it, erased. These were not stories of the rare or the extreme. They were stories of policy, of pattern, a design that turned childhood into compliance and intelligence into a liability. So yes, we can call it medieval, we can call it cruel, but we must also call it intentional, because this wasn't accidental overreach. It was a system crafted by adults, maintained by power, and enforced by the full weight of both religion and law. 8. Expelled for existing. By now, we've walked through medieval education's darkest corridors, beatings, cages, silence, labor, and prison. But there was still one last weapon in the teacher's arsenal, one that didn't bruise the skin, chain the wrists, or humiliate the spirit because it erased the student altogether. Permanent expulsion, the academic death sentence, used not rarely, not as a last resort, but routinely. Call it the medieval version of cancel culture, except in this world, you didn't lose followers, you lost your future. And what made it worse was that the reasons for these expulsions were as arbitrary as they were brutal. A child could be permanently banned for speaking out of turn, for sneezing during religious service, for asking a question during a lecture. Yes, curiosity itself was criminal. Some were expelled for being late, others for failing to memorize a prayer. One girl was expelled because she smiled improperly during morning chants. In this system, being a child imperfect, impulsive, full of wonder was the crime. And the punishment was exile. There were no second chances, no appeals, no probationary periods. A single act, one moment deemed inappropriate by the teacher meant you were out. And not just from that school. In many regions, being expelled from one institution meant being blacklisted from all others in the area. These weren't separate systems with multiple doors. They were a single gate, and once you were shut out, you were done. That was it. No education, no future, no way back. The expulsion didn't just affect the student, it cursed the family. Parents were shamed publicly. Some were barred from local guilds or churches. Others had their taxes raised or their names published as parents of failure. These were not just school decisions. They were community events. Stigma spread like wildfire, and once it took root, it stayed for generations. And if you think expulsion was at least used for serious infractions, think again. Many children were expelled not for what they did, but for what they lacked. Couldn't afford to pay winter heating fees. Expelled. Failed to bring candles for the evening mass. Expelled. Poor families who struggled to keep up with extra charges were punished not with leniency or support, but with removal. Their child's chance at education gone because they couldn't afford wax. Poverty became a disqualification. Not quietly, not apologetically, but officially. Teachers maintained lists of which students hadn't paid which dues. These weren't administrative notes. These were expulsion watch lists, and the cutoffs were strict. A family could be just a few days late. With tuition or ink, money and their child would be removed permanently. In a world where survival already demanded everything, this was the final insult. To be told your intelligence, your discipline, your promise none of it mattered. Only your payment status did. And for girls, the system was even more ruthless. Once a girl hit puberty, she was often expelled automatically. The justification: moral distraction. Her presence was now considered a threat to male students, to purity, to the illusion of academic virtue. It didn't matter how bright she was, how eager she remained. Her biology became a liability. She was gone, a 13-year-old girl who had studied for years, recited scriptures flawlessly, and carried herself with dignity, could be removed simply because she began menstruating. No scandal, no misconduct, just nature. And the school would wash its hands, and the family would be told, this is proper. That's how deeply embedded the misogyny was. Education wasn't a path for all. It was a selective privilege for boys who could pay and who fit the mold. Everyone else was disposable. Everyone else was temporary. And if you think that maybe expelled students could start again elsewhere, don't. In rural areas, there were no other schools. In cities, your name followed you. Some teachers wrote letters to other instructors, warning them to reject the student. Disruptive, unfit, ungodly, a permanent label, a ruined chance. A child marked not by failure, but by a system designed to punish difference. And this leads us to the ugliest truth of all. The expulsions weren't just disciplinary. They were strategic. They existed to cleanse the school of any deviation, be it poverty, femininity, illness, rebellion, or independent thought. The goal wasn't to teach, it was to preserve order, to protect the image of a perfect institution where only the obedient, the wealthy, and the silent could remain. And so, the door to education didn't close softly, it slammed shut, and behind it, generations of children were left in the cold, sometimes literally, and we must ask, how many minds were lost? How many thinkers were erased? How many artists, mathematicians, healers, or philosophers were never allowed to bloom because they sneezed, or smiled, or spoke the truth too soon? We'll never know, because the system ensured we wouldn't. 9. When fire taught the lesson. We've seen medieval classrooms wield pain like a religion and obedience like law. But there was still one punishment so extreme, so viscerally cruel, that even today it sounds like something from the darkest. corners of torture chambers. It wasn't just meant to hurt, was meant to burn, literally. Because for some teachers, the final word wasn't delivered with a rod or a sermon, but with fire. Not a metaphor, not poetic language, open flames, heated metal, burned flesh. In the 1400s, teachers in certain religious schools used hand burning as a disciplinary practice, and they didn't do it in secret. They believed it was righteous, a spiritual cleansing, a divine correction. If a student was seen as sinful, defiant, or impure, the answer wasn't forgiveness, it was fire. The idea was grotesquely simple. If the hand had written something offensive or had reached for something forbidden, it must be punished by flame. Teachers kept candles lit, not just for reading, but for retribution. In the most routine cases, students were forced to hold their hands over open flames during oral recitations. Miss a word, move your hand closer, flinch, closer still. Get it wrong again, skin singes. You're learning, they'd say. But what exactly were you learning? That thought equals pain. That curiosity equals danger. That school is not a place to grow, but to suffer. In more severe cases, teachers used metal rods heated until they glowed red. These weren't accidents. These were instruments. Fire pokers, branding irons, hand-forged tools placed beside scrolls and holy books like twisted school supplies. Some teachers even pressed these red-hot instruments directly onto a child's skin, typically the palm, the fingers, or the forearm. A wrong answer didn't just mean shamet, meant a scar. The burns were deep. They weren't treated, and they weren't meant to heal quickly. In an era without antiseptics, without antibiotics, a burn wasn't just pain, it was infection, fever, scarring. Some students lost mobility in their fingers. Some carried disfigurement for life. And here's the horror. Parents sometimes requested these punishments, not because they hated their children, but because they believed it saved their souls. Teachers told them that burning the body purified the spirit, that by scarring the flesh, they were cleansing the child's connection to sin. And so, the system turned suffering into salvation. A child returned home with bandaged hands, and the family thanked the teacher, thanked them, because medieval theology taught that discipline through suffering brought you closer to God. And what did that suffering look like? Open wounds, blackened skin, nights of sobbing into straw beds, while trying to memorize the next day's prayers with blistered fingers. Children were taught to associate fire with failure, with correction, with spiritual truth. Imagine the psychological aftermath. Every time a student saw a candle, they didn't think of warmth. They thought of pain, of punishment, of the moment they were held against flame for forgetting a verse. And long after the wound healed, the scar remained, on their skin and in their mind. This wasn't just abuse, it was indoctrination, a belief system fused with physical mutilation, and it shaped generations. These weren't isolated events. In some schools, burning punishments were as normalized as morning prayers. Some teachers even developed rituals around them, special recitations, incense, hymns, as if that made the act more holy. But nothing holy ever came from branding a child. And yet, for centuries, it was written into the soul of the classroom. Because pain made things memorable, and scars made them permanent. A burned child never asked again, never challenged again, never reached for more than what was offered. And that was the point. Learning was not about expansion, it was about restriction. The flame wasn't a tool of enlightenment. It was a warning, a mark, a silent promise that if you strayed too far from obedience, your body would carry the memory forever. And for those students, forever meant forever. They grew into adults with damaged fingers that trembled, nerves that misfired, skin that blistered at the touch of heat, and each time someone asked what happened, they had to relive it, tell the story, or worse, hide it, pretend it didn't happen, pretend they were never burned in a classroom by a man of faith and power who called it justice. Because who would believe them? Who would care? And that's the legacy of these acts. Not just the pain, but the silence that followed. A culture so steeped in cruelty, it confused it for morality. And a world where a scar was considered a lesson, not a wound. But we know better now. We must. Because if we ever forget that a classroom once held fire to a child's hand in the name of learning, then we haven't learned anything at all. 10. What the scars still teach us. We've traveled through the haunted halls of medieval educational world, where classrooms became cages, teachers became tormentors, and childhood became a battlefield for obedience. We've seen birch rods, soaked in salt water, knees crushed on dried peas, children imprisoned in wooden boxes, humiliated in marketplaces, and scarred for life by fire. And through it all, one question hangs in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. How was any of this ever considered normal? The answer lies not just in history, but in human psychology. Medieval society wasn't built around the idea of nurturing potential. It was built on hierarchy, piety, and control. Schools weren't incubators for ideas, they were factories. For submission, the child was not seen as a seed to water, but as a weed to prune and till. All that remained was stillness and obedience. Pain wasn't an unfortunate byproduct. It was the point. The agony wasn't accidental. It was ritualized, institutionalized, sanctified, and the system told parents that the deeper the scar, the cleaner the soul, that the more a child suffered, the closer they came to virtue. It's easy to sit here, centuries later, and condemn it all, to shake our heads and say, barbaric, unthinkable, but that would be too easy and too dangerous. Because these systems didn't disappear overnight. They evolved, they softened, they changed their tools, but sometimes not their intentions. Even today, remnants of this thinking remain. When a child is silenced instead of heard, when discipline is valued more than understanding, when shame is used as a shortcut for structure, and while we no longer burn hands or bolt classroom doors, we must still ask, are we truly listening to our children? Are we building schools that cultivate wonder or just enforce compliance in prettier packaging? Because every generation inherits the ghost of the one before. And if we don't confront those ghosts, they don't disappear, they adapt. That's what makes this story matter. Not the shock, not the horror, but the warning. That cruelty, when cloaked in righteousness, can flourish in any era. That silence, when mistaken for virtue, can become a prison of its own. And that if we want a better future, we have to start by refusing to repeat the past, not just in action, but in attitude, because the children who were beaten, locked away, humiliated, silenced, and scarred, many of them didn't make it. They never had the chance to become what they could have been, and that is a loss no curriculum can repair. But their stories, their pain, their survival, we remember those. We must. Because in remembering them, we take back something that system tried to erase, the belief that learning should feel like freedom, not punishment, that education should lift us, not brand us, that children, in all their missinses, curiosity, and rebellion are not defects to fix but minds to guide. And if there is a single lesson to carry forward, let it be this: the cost of cruelty in the name of education is not just bruises or broken spirits. It's a world that forgets how to dream. We owe them better. We owe ourselves better. Let the last scar teach the last lesson. Medieval education wasn't just harsh, it was a system that sanctified suffering and confused control for teaching. It reminds us how dangerous it is when institutions prioritize obedience over understanding, punishment over progress. The scars left behind physical and emotional are warnings, not footnotes. The lesson isn't just that this happened, it's that we must never let it happen again.